well, I know I was first drawn to photography, and that started at a pretty early age. I think my mom had an old Olympus SLR, and somehow it ended up in my hands and kind of never left it. And, at some point, I think I started stringing the photos together in a more sort of photojournalistic, narrative way. And, initially was very much interested in photojournalism. And then ultimately, I started to sort of recognize cinematography in film and thought about that as a medium that I, could use some of the photographic skills, but in a somewhat more narrative way.
When you look at your photography and then you look at your work in film, is there a way that you can categorize your particular point of view? Are there attributes that you find in common between the two?
I think the commonality is probably looking for sort of humanity and emotion in a very concise way. I would say the differences are that I was never interested in lighting in photography, lighting in a strobe fashion type sense. I almost couldn't be less interested in that. But when it came to film, I was very interested in lighting, often still in a recreation of naturalism, but lighting as a skill set, is something that I really like in cinematography and really couldn't care less about in still photography. But as far as, compositionally, I think, my eye is very much my eye, and those, traits tend to overlap.
Tell me about the subject and photographing and lighting the subject, because I'm thinking of, in particular, you've done a lot of master classes on the Oprah network.
Yeah.
I think, and I've seen several of those, and the subjects are always so beautifully photographed. How do you go about in anything you do of getting kind of the essence of the subject you're photographing?
Masterclass is interesting because I sort of inherited that look. I think Bob Richmond maybe set it up initially, and that was sort of there was a decision made not to use an edge light and to be very very focused on sort of the key and sort of how much the contrast ratio affected the subject and everything like that. And Masterclass is interesting because you kind of can research people's histories and know how far to push it, and certainly, obviously, with the women, and particularly the older women, there are limits to that. But, the interesting thing in what we do is sort of, how lighting for drama, how to sort of balance lighting for drama and lighting for beauty, and I think that's the challenge with Masterclass.
I would imagine you kind of make yourself familiar with the various strengths of a particular actor or subject, so you have a better understanding of how to photograph them? Or?
This is new. In the last few years, I've started to, light and shoot more well-known actors who, often bring their own histories and occasionally baggage to the table as far as, good sides and bad sides and, what they will and won't let you get away with. But, I think generally you sort of have a dialogue and say, this is what I'm looking to do for the sake of your character, and this is the emotional journey I see you taking, and these are where I think the stakes are highest, and then how far will you let me push it? And that it's nice to really, that's actually a conversation that the director needs to sort of have going into it.
And something like Fruitvale Station, which is such a phenomenal, heartbreaking film. But you can even see it in behind-the-scenes photographs on the set of you shooting the actors, and there's this immediacy to it, where you're in very, very kind of close at times, and I'm wondering, it feels like it must be some sort of dance in a way between camera and actor.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what it was, and it required a huge amount of trust, for all parties involved. I think, Ryan trusted me very implicitly with the camera and the camera movement. often when you have a dialogue, I mean, I like to operate myself for this reason too, but, when you try to have a dialogue with the operator, by the time you've, given them your note, it's like a bad game of telephone. Sort of by the time you've given them your note, the moment has been missed. And so I think one of the things that really came together with Fruitvale was sort of the immediacy, and I think it was very reactionary. I was sort of watching and responding to the actors, movements and the actors' emotional states, and Ryan was trusting me to do that, and sort of, he was directing performance, but we'd had all of our conversations beforehand so that we didn't have to sort of, be checking back in on the day. We were very much in sync with one another, and the actors were very much in sync with me, and, even to the point of, I got so in it, at one point we were shooting the domestic scenes in Ryan's aunt and his grandma's house, and they're very small locations. I think you can sort of see that. And I was wedged between the cabinet and the stove, literally shooting under the cabinets, and I'm in this, kind of contorted position, and I must have kicked the gas on with my foot, and Octavia just, break scene for 1 second just to point out that I'm about to start a fire and go up in flames. So I can thank her for saving me on that one. But, I think it was very much just exactly that, dancing a dance with the actors and with the director, and sound and everybody else involved.
It makes me think of what actors talk about a lot, which is to prepare for a role, they study up. They study, and then they kind of let it go once they get on set so they can exist in the moment. And I guess it's a similar process for a cinematographer.
Yeah, I think that's what I would like it to be. I find that often prep gets really truncated, especially on the lower budget movies, which, I tend to have been drawn to. And that's really unfortunate because nothing sort of prepares you better for production than the work you do in prep. I think even Ryan and I would have liked to spend more time, watching movies together and looking at visual references, but thankfully our jumping off point was already very like-minded. But yeah, I think that is the goal, I think, as a DP too, because you're gonna want to let, you may go in with the most concrete plan of, shot listed, to death, and then the actor does something spontaneous, and you want to be able to go with it. You want to be able to let them improvise and to react to their improvisation. And, part of being able to do that is being in tune with, everybody from the director to the production designer, so that you're not, so you're all thinking in one sort of visual style, and if you have to change things on the fly, you're changing it in a way that, is for the greater good of the story, and that everybody would, agree with, but you often have to make those decisions on the drop of a dime. So
you mentioned something like you wish you could have watched some more films with Ryan. Do you often do that? Do you reference other movies in the pre-production phase?
Yeah, everything from still photography to paint to paintings to movies. It's the nice thing about movies is that you can sort of respond to multiple facets at the same time. Like if a director brings something to the table and says, I like this, you can say, well, do you like? Is it the lighting that you like, or the composition, or the contrast, or what? You can sort of go into more three-dimensional detail about what it is that they're responding to. Whereas, sometimes with two-dimensional photo or paintings, it's just sort of a tone-based discussion. This is the tone that I'm going for. But yeah, I find that it's often really helpful for getting people on the same page and knowing sort of, what direction different scenes are going to go. It's very helpful.
Is there a danger that you could become that everyone involved can become kind of a slave to those influences?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in this era, sort of, it's very hard to be original because everything's been done before, and then, you definitely have to be wary that you're not, simply recreating, the best, the repurposing, I guess, the things that have influenced you in the past to such an extent that you're not left with your own voice. And also for the same reason that I said before, is that if you come in there's no such thing as being too prepared, but if you come in too definitive, then you can miss the beauty of reacting to great moments that maybe you hadn't anticipated. Most actors like to do a certain amount of their own blocking. So no matter how much you or the director had envisioned, this scene is going to be two people sitting down at a table, and then maybe they'll get up at this beat and walk to the refrigerator. The actors might get to the table and say, actually, I really want to be standing, and I don't think I'd go to the refrigerator here. I think I'd walk out the door, and you have to be sort of ready for that.
Tell me how you broke in to the industry.
I kind of just did it. Like I did it in my own way, which was a combination of photo and then documentary and then a little bit of more narrative cinematography. But I never went the AC route, in part because I think I have been a terrible AC. It's just not the same skill set that I use for my cinematography. But I don't really know. It's kind of one of those things where I had started to get into documentary in a way that I was really happy with, and then the economy fell apart, and I ended up sort of having to fall back on reality, which I was never that excited about. And then I decided to go back to grad school, and I went to AFI as like a conscious choice to take myself out of the reality world for fear that I would, end up living in it forever. And while the program was exceptional and I learned from so many great, influences, I came out with a ton of debt. And so then I actually had to, you often end up having to sort of fall back on what which for me was reality. Although fortunately I lucked into the hills, which was a very lit sort of blocked reality, and actually prepared me, with a lot of the tool set that I use in my narrative work. But it took a few years of, sort of hammering away at the debt to get to a place where then I could sort of, go back to the thing that I wanted to do all along, which was narrative cinematography. And it's, a little bit roundabout, but it worked out in the end.
When you're talking about reality and documentary filmmaking, I've read something interesting, and it's more focused on directing, I think, but maybe this applies to cinematography as well. There's the verite style where you're kind of a fly on the wall, and then I saw something that Werner Herzog says that he doesn't believe in being a fly on the wall. He, even in documentary filmmaking, he wants to provoke. Do you see merits in both approaches, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like the Maisleys used to run something like 30,000 feet or non-existent feet through the mag. They would roll for days and days and days before they'd actually ever load any film into the camera, just to get to a place where they felt like, their subjects wouldn't be cognizant of them. And, that's one way to go about it, but it's hard to imagine that anyone's ever not cognizant of the camera that's in the room or the camera even that's across the street. There's this, peripheral knowledge that you are being photographed. And so, I think it's sort of hard not to inform, the subject of what you're doing, not impossible. But then, the very sort of breaking down the fourth wall, kind of staring straight at the camera, Errol Morris, sensibility is a whole, is sort of the whole other extreme. And I think they're both very effective. I think that they each have their own merits, and, maybe it depends on the subject matter and the subject being interviewed or the subject being photographed.
You mentioned the subject matter, and I just when you get a script or you get a project, what are the most important questions you ask usually to formulate a visual look for it?
I mean, I tend to be most concerned with the emotional beats. Whose story is it? And that's not always. It's not always one person for any one film. It can be many different subject stories, and sometimes they inhabit the same scene, but you still have to ask yourself, who's driving the scene and who's being who's being more affected. So I guess breaking down each of the characters' sort of emotional arcs, and then the overarching, what am I trying to say? What is the conflict, and what are the goals, and where do we want to leave the audience at the end? Those are the questions that I usually start with.
Yeah, and tell me, when you collaborate with a director, what is the kind of dialogue that you prefer with them?
I mean, my perfect collaboration is just that. It's a collaboration. I think, there are directors who are very, very technical and very, very specific in the way that, even I think Hitchcock storyboarded every single shot. And I don't know that, as much as it would be a great honor to work for Hitchcock, I don't know if that would be me. I think at some point then you're just sort of a technician and a button pusher. So if that's one extreme, the other is a director who really just wants to focus on the actors and the performances. It kind of, will leave everything up to the DP when it comes to sort of, lighting and camera and sort of the overall look of the film. And that's sort of, I'm not sure that's, that exciting to me either. I like coming to the table with, with some of my ideas and then listening to some of the directors and really kind of working through which is best for the story that we're trying to tell, and also, trying to inspire each other to step up our games, and it's just the creative process of collaboration is the thing that is, I think most interesting to me, and why I got into cinematography ultimately above, say, photojournalism was, to be part of something bigger than myself and to be collaborative with, many more people than myself.
Is there always a question? Especially on something like Tim and Eric's $1 billion movie, where you're able to do some fairly crazy things when you collaborate with them. Is there always a question if you're going too far, or is this going to work?
Tim and Eric's interesting because I sort of fell into that. I actually had never worked with them on their show and didn't know much about it. I did a short for them for the HBO series Funny or Die, and I, tried to light it in a very sort of dark and cinematic way, but still allowed them the room to move. And I think that was the first time that they felt like they were, given the best of both worlds. That their experience in the past had been that they could either have total freedom to improv and, on a comedic level, but that the lighting was always very flat and they, weren't that thrilled with it. Or they were, they'd done shorts and things before that were very cinematic, but they felt very inhibited in terms of where they could and couldn't be and standing on marks and blah, blah, blah. And so after that short, they sort of looked at me and they said, we want you to shoot our movie. And I looked behind and I looked around and I was like, me? I have very little experience with comedy, actually, and, was kind of surprised to be that choice. But, it was interesting and unique and exciting in its own way. And so I was trying to sort of do that on a much larger scale. The problem was that the location was ginormous. We were in this abandoned shopping mall in downtown Palm Springs that you would never know existed, but that had all of the copper stripped. In the 12 years that it had been abandoned, it had lost all power. And despite the promise that we'd have working power by the time we shot, we really didn't. So it was like everything, if you wanted to do anything in deep background, you had to run a whole new layer of distro just to light it. And you were asking about pushing things too far. I don't even know what too far is in that world. I think that they push things much further in their television show than we went in the movie version. I actually think we probably, by some of their Tim and Eric nerd fan standards, didn't push it far enough. I just know that for me, looking around, there were times where I was, amazed that was my reality at the moment.
And I'm also curious about environment and establishing environment and the importance of locations. I mean, when you're doing something like Fruitvale Station, when you're portraying the day in the life of this lead character, how much time do you spend in that world, in those locations, to get a feel for them?
Well, Fruitvale locations were everything. I mean, Fruitvale. Actually, let me step back. I think locations are everything anyway, and certainly in independent cinema, cinematography is only as good as locations meet production design. I can't say that loudly enough to people who are, who are trying to make movies for no money, spend your time finding great locations that will enable you to do that, because you really can only, when you don't have the budget to recreate, you really have to take something at a base level that's very cinematic and then shoot it at the right time of day or whatever else. There are tons of tricks for making things look like, make the production value much higher than what it actually is, and it begins and ends with the location, to be honest. But with Fruitvale, it was very specific, which is that, it was Ryan really set out to do something that was incredibly authentic. It was all, the script and his recreation. There are some narrative liberties, but it was the whole script was based on depositions from, Oscar's family and the actual cell phone messages and text messages and, recreating what he had done that entire day. And so shooting in the real locations were, exceedingly important to him and to the story on the whole. So that was, Farmer Joe's was the grocery store that Oscar worked at and that he revisited that day. And the BART platform was not only the actual BART platform, but we had Michael B. Jordan laying on top of, you can see there's a crack in the ceramic tile where the bullet actually, pierced Oscar's skin. And so it was just, incredibly important to the story. And obviously that meant a certain amount of sacrifice, for me. Like I to be able to shoot in those locations meant shooting in the real hospital during working hours. So I could obviously light from the ground, but I couldn't go changing out every overhead bulb, and that was true. I mean, we were actually in the real morgue where Oscar was taken, and at any given point somebody could have, we could have gotten, and we knew this while we were shooting, that we could have gotten shut down if a body had come in. And so then the lights had to be, rigged in a way that it was, that if we had to vacate, that our lights weren't going to fall down or anything like that. But so, creatively it was about matching color temperatures with our movie lights to all the lights in the real spaces, and making choices about, how to enhance the contrast, or, what areas to avoid if we could. And I mean, literally behind the camera and pretty much every shot in the hospital are patients waiting to be seen.
When you're doing something like that, I mean, you're recreating the last day of this man's life, and you're using all of these real locations. You must feel the weight of that. I mean, it must feel kind of sacred in a way.
I mean, absolutely. And I think, sacred's a very well put word. It was very heavy, and I think everybody was sort of, involved for that reason, and to try to do some kind of justice to a man who lost his life, and also to a area. I mean, the whole Bay Area was very shaken by the whole event, and I think that weighed on every choice we made and every step we took. But even to the point that, like, on the BART platform, it was kind of a miracle that BART agreed to let us shoot there, given all of the political turmoil that had surrounded the event. And it was a very last-minute decision that we actually did get access. But they were conscious of and nervous about media attention, and that anybody getting wind of this, that it could turn into another round of protests. And so we sort of had to shoot undercover between 1:15 and 5:15 a.m. while all of the BART was closed. And even knowing that we only had 4 hours, we had 4 hours a night over the course of 3 nights, which amounts to basically the total of one film day to get all of the footage that you see on the BART platform. And even with those as our parameters, we took 5 minutes at the beginning of every day and just did a crew circle, and Ryan said some words, and you could call it a prayer, you could call it a commemoration, but just that we sort of checked back in with why we were all there, and it was really, it was really special and really humbling.
But let's talk about the sound of my voice. Tell me how that project came about for you, and what about it spoke to you.
It's something actually that I was involved with almost from the inset with Zal and Britt, and at the time there was, it took on various forms. At one point it was going to be a web series. I think it was actually, the last form was a feature. It didn't originate as such. And, I was somewhat involved from script phase, although, it was very much their labor of love, the writing process. But, at one point there was going to be a lot more money, and I think it was ABC or somebody got behind the web series version of it, and then that sort of fell apart. And then I think we were looking for more money for the feature, and then around the time the DSLRs came out, kind of the impetus to just make it and get it done and make it for whatever we had, which wasn't very much. And so we went for it.
And the movie's really, in terms of the feeling of it, there's a great sense of claustrophobia in the movie. And you're dealing with kind of almost two worlds, the outside of the world of this cult and certainly the inside of it, which feels a lot more claustrophobic. I would imagine that was by design.
Yeah, very much so. And, we approached, the cinematography group with that kind of perspective, too, was sort of, the voyeuristic component of always feeling like you're being watched sort of once the stakes get raised in conjunction with, the claustrophobia, and exactly like you said, the claustrophobia inside the small spaces, and then a freedom and liberation when you're outside, and what that dichotomy is like.
And also the use of color in it. What were the discussions about the color of that environment that you were creating?
The cult environment, Zal had a very clear. He kept referencing tea, like the stain of tea on white fabric, which, from a cinematography perspective is kind of terrifying because, the only thing worse than white is off-white when you're dealing with skin tones, and especially in, constrained environments and people up against walls that are very, similarly colored to their skin. It was actually very challenging for me. And then outside, the outside world, it was a little bit, I recently talked about this, about how sort of technology affects, my choices in my work. And the thing about, DSLRs when they first came out, there was no sort of cine, not that they have a ton of latitude now, but they have a lot more latitude than they did when we were shooting with them. I think it was still at the stages where you had to trick the aperture open. It had just gotten the 24 frame upgrade. But, as far as color rendition goes, you were talking about, I think it was 420 8-bit color space, and it was very, very limited. It was all baked in. And so the sort of off tones of both, the skin kind of goes a weird salmon color, and, nothing is quite as you see it, in natural life. It sort of worked for that story. It was not a conscious choice, and I probably, if I was given the option to do it again with, an Alexa or with film, I would certainly take it. But it kind of had this otherworldly quality that, because of the nature of the story we're telling, it actually served the story well.
But with film, isn't there always a kind of mystery element, a kind of a question mark? And yet with digital, you can essentially
see what you're getting.
Real time.
Yeah, and there are pros and cons to both of those things. I mean, I love the mystery element of film. I think, there's something really organic about the randomness of it that, to me is much more lifelike. But at the same time, it's, it can be a little bit terrifying. The last two of the three movies I did were both lower budget, and it meant that I didn't see dailies. They weren't digital dailies, and I didn't see what I was shooting until 4 or 5 days later. And it's like there's the excitement of opening up a present and not knowing what it's going to be and how great that is, but then there's also the fear involved of, something not quite matching what you were expecting. The only surprise I got in my last film was there was a scene that was in a mine that was, underground and very dark, and I had lights sort of flaring the camera intentionally, and there was, when I got the dailies back, the bokeh had a bit of a starlight quality to it, and I certainly star filter wasn't the goal of that image. And if it was digital, I would have seen that right away. But it also was kind of a weird, happy accident that I'm sure will at some point become my favorite shot in the movie.
Yeah. A lot of these movies several movies that you've done, including Sound of My Voice, if I'm not mistaken, it's with a first-time feature director.
Yeah.
Is there something exciting to you about getting in on those collaborations when they're just embarking on their filmmaking career?
It is exciting. I would say what's exciting to me is often the scripts. I find that you get to take more chances. I tend to be drawn to these sort of dramatic scripts that maybe wouldn't get a ton of funding, with a studio format, and so that's sort of how I end up on so many kind of ground level projects. The first time director is also exciting. It can be exhausting too, but I like the challenges. I think that I'm pretty good at sort of walking people through options that they may not have realized or thought about, and I guess there's an element of teaching that is interesting to me, as opposed to having somebody who's so set in their ways that this is how it is.
Yeah. And tell me about Any Day Now, a really strong character piece, and an important kind of topic to explore. So I would imagine this was another example where the actual themes and the subject of the film were the main drawing points for you.
Yeah, and Travis wasn't a first-time director. He had done The Space Between with Melissa Leo, which was a very compelling character piece as well. And I think for me it was a combination of the script and then talking to Travis and really liking him and his ideas that made me want to do Any Day Now. And certainly, not unlike Fruitvale, it's a very timely topic, and very important and very poignant. And I was drawn to the social nature of the film as well, the social impact nature of it. But very strong characters, and Alan and Garrett and Isaac, who plays Marco, just knock it out of the park as far as really drawing the audience in and making this family unit that you just care so much about and you want to succeed.
This is one of the things that interests me. Because when you look at Alan Cumming and Garrett Dillahunt, two great actors, but you would imagine that they come at it from a different way, their acting process. And I'm curious. Obviously, the director is the main conduit between with the actors, but what is your involvement and conversation with the actors on set? What does that consist of?
I mean, it really depends on the actor and on the film. I feel like I've now worked with everybody actors who run the gamut from being very methody and being very sort of in character, and so your conversation with them is really, you're having a conversation with their character, not with them as an actor. And then other actors who are much more sort of, they're themselves, and in the second you say roll camera, they turn into this other character. And actually that was, to some extent, I would say Alan's a little more methody and Garrett's a little more, making a joke right up until the point you say roll camera, and then he immediately assumes this very dramatic and stoic role. And I would say that sort of speaks to their differences and to the differences of working with different actors. Yeah, I mean, Garrett's. If you look at his body of work, it really just runs the gamut, from comedy to horror to drama. And Alan tends to be more along the line of dramatic, but he's also actually very funny.
Yeah, well, yeah, he's very funny. I don't know why I feel like an actor like Alan Cumming, there would be a lot of spontaneity. Like everybody would need to be on their toes, but maybe that's not.
I would say on their A game more than on their toes. I think that he definitely brings a real passion to every work that he does, and so you have to step it up right there alongside him. And I think that that's true of most great actors. It's like they inspire you to want to be the best version of yourself.
And tell me about working in period, because you're working in the period of the 70s in this film. How much do you pay attention to period detail? Obviously you do, but and also is there a danger of kind of getting swallowed up in too much period detail?
Well, the question in this case is working in period on a budget, because I think that's the real limiting factor. We did a lot of tests with. I worked with the optics technician at Panavision named Guy McVicker to sort of test, various lenses that were going to kind of help lend a period feel to the film. And, we knew we were shooting on the red for budgetary reasons, so then kind of how to dial down the sort of crisp, modern look of the red and turn it into something that resembles, a washed-out 70s photograph. And that took a little bit of sort of testing and processing. But as far as, like, the onset, concerns with being period, it's not a coincidence that there are very few wides in the movie, and that's largely because outside of every frame is some element of the modern world, Wi-Fi, sort of instead of a payphone, it's a Wi-Fi here sign or whatever. It's just like it's sort of hard to, when you're doing something on an indie budget, you can't build from scratch, and so you're sort of at the mercy of what's around. But I think with anything, at the end of the day, I mean, I love environments, and I tend to be drawn to projects that are kind of a character piece within an environmental piece, or a character portraiture within also an environmental portraiture, and
sure.
And I think the trick, though, is not to get so caught up in the environment that you're missing the character. At the end of the day, it's the human emotion, and that's gonna tell the story, and no amount of period detail is gonna trump the importance of sort of getting the tone of the the human component right. I would say that as long as you have a mind to the sort of character first, environment second, but obviously with both details bearing some weight.
Photographically, is there also a look to that period of time that you can describe?
Yeah, I mean, I think that 70s, at least from a film component, it always, to me, I think of sort of slightly desaturated colors and milkier blacks and very some of the early Bruce Davidson photographs from the Subway series, or I don't know, I guess I think of 70s photography, and maybe it's the irony is maybe it's 70s photography 30 years later that gives it that sort of washed out quality, but that's sort of what comes to mind for me, and that was something that we were looking to do with our post work and also in camera work. I was really trying to do as much of it optically as possible and not leave it to the I didn't want it to feel like we hit the 70s button in post. I really wanted to, do it. We worked obviously with the production designer to kind of limit the use of very saturated colors, and the glass that we used has now been rehoused as P vintage glass, but at the time it was literally glass from the late 60s and early 70s that didn't have a glare. It had no anti-glare coating, so it's like you pointed at any, even near any sort of window or light, and it kind of, washed out the whole image, and that was kind of what we were looking for. I think we added a little bit of blue to the blacks in post, which is something else that I feel like when you look at some of the 70s, photography, there's this, the blacks are sort of brownish, bluish blacks, and that was something that, we couldn't do in camera. But other than that, it wasn't a heavily affected post process. It was really done as much optically as possible.
And like you said, it all hinges upon portraying the human truth of the movie more than the period details. Because I was watching a movie last week, and it took place in the 70s, and I thought, this movie looks incredible. It actually looks as though it was shot in the 70s. It has that photographic quality. And then I realized halfway through it, well, I'm only taken by that look, and had very little else about this movie. So So obviously, with a movie like Any Day Now, you paid attention to the human element more than anything, and that's what makes that movie work. But
I think that's sort of true. If you walk out of a movie and all you're thinking about is the look and how great the cinematography is, and the world that was created, and that's it, then in some ways the cinematographer has failed at their job. It's really about creating an immersive experience where the audience is relating to the story and to the characters, and the cinematography is almost secondary.
That's got to be a tricky line, though, between feeling the freedom to maybe approach something from a different perspective, or something thinking a little bit outside the box, and yet not making it so much that it draws so much attention to itself that it distracts from the drama of the actual scene.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point, and I think it is a tricky line, and I definitely feel like, I have been so kind of wary of crossing it that maybe I haven't taken enough chances cinematographically, for not wanting to draw attention to myself, and I think that's actually like a challenge I want to take on is how do you push the button a little bit and be original but not be distracting. How do you make sure that something's still in service to the story, but you can, you can do something a little outside the box? It's a really valid question.
Correct me if I'm wrong. You've shot a horror film for John McNaughton?
Yeah. It's somewhere between a horror and a thriller. I would describe it as a thriller. He would probably call it a horror, but it rides that line.
Is there a freedom to working in that genre where you could be a little bit more experimental, or? Yeah,
there is actually. My sort of tendency, in terms of the projects that I usually choose and the lighting that I'm usually drawn to is more grounded in naturalism, and obviously when you go that direction, thriller/horror, you have much more liberty to play stylistically, and that becomes sort of inherent to the medium. So that was fun. I definitely went a little further with color separation than I normally would, and things could go crazy green, blue, cyan for their own reasons. It's not the genre that I want to live in. It was sort of both comedy and horror were fun to sort of hone different skills, but if I could get pigeonholed in any drama, in any genre, it would be drama. Just sort of what I've always been drawn to.
What are you doing next? What are you working on next?
I literally just got back 2 days ago from 10 weeks in West Virginia on a project about it was an ensemble drama about a mining community in the aftermath of a disaster, sort of a small town, affected by one incident. And now I'm just recuperating. I'm not sure what's next. I'm trying to stay local, which is harder and harder to do in Los Angeles if you like drama. But I think I'm going to, take a little time and maybe try to do a couple commercials while I wait to figure out what exactly is next.
Isn't that something, though, and that the fact that the majority of film production no longer takes place in Los Angeles anymore, does it?
It's tragic. It's tragic for those of us who sort of came here because this is, was the land of the movies, and settled down, and now you have to leave home to do the thing that you love. I really hope that this whole the mayor just appointed a film czar, and with the idea of trying to bring production back to the state. We'll see. I hope that it.
I hope so. They need to offer some kind of credits or incentives, because places like New Orleans they're becoming the new Hollywood in a way.
Yeah. There's so little incentive here right now between the exorbitant cost of locations and the fact that there's no tax credit. It literally doesn't make sense to shoot movies here. Yeah.
My last question for you. This is what we're closing up all of these interviews with. If you were to teach a class on cinematography and you had to choose scenes or entire films to teach various lessons on the art, which ones would you choose?
Oh my God, that's such a big question. I would probably start with La Jetée, with Chris Marker's, narrative constructed of still photographs as a basis for cinematography. I think it's, that's just incredibly brilliant. All of Godfather, for use of light and shadow, and all the things that come up regularly. I think for the type of work that I'm most interested in, I think City of God is an absolutely inspiring film for the intimacy and the reacting to things as they happen and being at the right place at the right time and really allowing the audience to to feel like they're living the story. That was certainly one of the goals with Fruitvale, and we took some of that from City of God. Was just wanting to kind of take people out of the movie theater and just plop them down in the middle of this environment that maybe they weren't so accustomed to.